So glad to be here. Kimsey here today. I hope everyone got to enjoy the eclipse. The light still looks a little funny here. I'm in Denver, Colorado, so we're not in like the main belt that it's going through. But it was still really cool to see. So I hope everyone's out there enjoying it. So I am hopping on today. I took a week off. If anybody noticed, I took a week off because last week we were in Austin, Texas, visiting family and celebrating my little girl's first birthday, which was really special and really exciting. So I had scheduled out posts and I was planning on going live while I was in Austin. And then Monday came around and I was like, you know what? No. I'm going to be present. I'm going to take this week off. We hadn't taken off longer than like a long weekend since my daughter was born. So we soaked up the family time and it was really wonderful. So I am going to go live today, though, on the topic that I was going to talk about at that time last Monday. And that is, I'm going to talk today about one of the biggest root causes of poor mental health and performance at least in the United States, that I see clinically, but that is also very well documented in the literature. And that is blood sugar dysregulation, especially high blood sugar. But we're going to talk about the gamut: high blood sugar, low blood sugar, what's called reactionary hypoglycemia. I'll explain what that is. So let me notify everyone that I'm going live. I'm also streaming on Instagram on my new page, which I've recently put together. It's called Wellness with Kimsey. A friend of mine is helping me manage it, and I'm super excited about this and the direction that this is going. So this is my first live on that new page. So anybody on Facebook that doesn't follow me on this new Instagram page, it's called Wellness with Kimsey, and it's all about specifically mental health, especially anxiety, with a focus on women, ambitious, working moms and busy women struggling with their mental health or performance. So make sure to follow me over there. All right, so let me notify. Some people did say that they wanted to be notified when I went live on this topic last week. So let me do that real quick, and then I'm going to jump into it. Okay. All right. So, like I said, I am talking today about the role that blood sugar dysregulation plays in our mental health and performance. I'm going to take a special focus on anxiety and ADD symptoms, but please know that this applies to depression, ADHD. Alzheimer's, neurodegeneration, Parkinson's. It really aggravates all things having to do with the brain and nervous system. And that is like I said, blood sugar dysregulation, high blood sugar, low blood sugar, reactionary hypoglycemia, and high insulin are all things that we're going to talk about. And the reason being is because chronically elevated blood sugar and insulin is one of the biggest drivers behind neuroinflammation. To give you an idea, the southern United States, the diabetes belt of America, also happens to have the greatest usage of psychiatric drugs, right? To really drive this point home, we can also appreciate that Alzheimer's has long been referred to as type 3 diabetes because in Alzheimer's pathophysiology, the brain cells themselves actually become insulin resistant. So, and the literature makes it very clear and can connect blood sugar dysregulation back to a plethora of mental health and nervous system neurological disorders. So let me explain what I mean by blood sugar dysregulation and what that is. And then the trajectory for today's talk, I'm going to try to keep this within like 20 minutes so it's easy for people to digest. But I'm going to talk about the importance of blood sugar in the body and what blood sugar dysregulation is and the different shapes that can take. And then I'm going to jump right into nutrition and lifestyle factors that can help improve your blood sugar, because that's the beauty of this, is dysregulated or imbalanced blood sugar is a diet and lifestyle problem. largely a diet and lifestyle problem, which means that it can be fixed largely through adjusting your diet and lifestyle. Okay, so blood sugar. Blood sugar, glucose, those two terms are used interchangeably. So glucose, blood sugar, is the body's easiest source of fuel. What that means is if glucose is available, and we get glucose, for simplicity's sake in today's talk, we get glucose largely from carbohydrates. I'm not going to get into the technical nuances of how, like, protein or fatty acids can be broken down into converted into glucose. That beyond the scope of today's talk. So for our intents and purposes, carbohydrates is where we get glucose. So it's the body's easiest source of fuel. And what that means is if glucose is available, the body will always use glucose for fuel. However, we are designed to be what's called metabolically flexible. And what that means is if glucose is not available, like ancestrally speaking, we couldn't find food, right? So maybe we're going a day, 2, 3, 4 days without eating, or maybe we're only eating, exclusively meat. We could only hunt, we couldn't forage. So it's a very low carb diet. So for reasons like that, we're designed to be metabolically flexible, which means if glucose is not available, our body shifts over the assembly line and starts burning fat for fuel in the form of ketones. And that ensures that our brain and internal organs, vital organs, get all of the fuel that they need to support their metabolic demands. And it prevents hypoglycemia. Now, for the first time ever in our history, glucose is always available. And because the body is adaptive, we will begin to lose that metabolic flexibility and become what is called glucose dependent. How that shows up is if we don't have glucose, if we don't eat for longer than 2 hours, in some cases, right? 2, 3, 4 hours, instead of the body shifting over and burning fat for fuel, preserving balanced energy and blood sugar, then blood sugar just plummets instead, and hypoglycemia symptoms can kick in. So let's talk about how this applies to the brain. The brain, even though it only weighs 2% of our body weight, the brain demands 20% of our fuel supply. For this reason, some of the symptoms of hypoglycemia are first symptoms are neurological in nature. So for example, do you become ravenously hungry? Like, I need to eat now if you go longer than a few hours without eating. Some other symptoms are shakiness, hangry, and irritability. I know Snickers made a commercial about that a long time ago, almost normalizing it. It's not normal. Hangry is not normal. So tired, shaky, ravenously hungry, yawning. Some people become foggy. Some people become kind of disorganized or have a hard time focusing. There can be sleep disturbances, especially if you wake up in the middle of the night feeling anxious. Anxiety, like daytime anxiety, depression, apathy, all of these things can be signs of low blood sugar. So let's also talk about what happens. You don't go from like normal blood sugar to diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which is the top end of the spectrum of high blood sugar overnight. So let's talk about the progression. But actually, before I go there, I want to include one other caveat to drive this point home. So, low blood sugar is a physiological stressor. What that means is, again, ancestrally speaking, we didn't necessarily know where our next meal was coming from. So low blood sugar could very well mean famine. So because of that, we have 4 hormones that are designed to raise blood sugar if it drops too low. High blood sugar, on the other hand, well, actually, I want to mention it's glucagon, cortisol, norepinephrine, epinephrine are all designed to raise blood sugar if it drops too low. So think about that. Cortisol, norepinephrine, epinephrine, right? Cortisol and adrenaline are all designed to raise blood sugar if it drops too low. So right there is an immediate aha of how that can trigger anxiety and poor focus, right? If we've got adrenaline and cortisol surging through our body all the time. And listen, people listening, if you're one of those people that wakes up, has coffee with a sugary creamer in it, or just sugar in your coffee, and skip breakfast and don't eat until 12, 1, 2 o'clock, and you're just living off of coffee and sugar for the first couple of hours of the day, that is a recipe for this situation. That is a recipe to hit a wall at the end of the day, in the mid-afternoon, to feel anxious early on in the day, to get foggy, that is the worst case scenario that you could do for your body. Okay, because then you're just basically throwing fire onto it, fire onto fire, gasoline onto the fire. There we go, gasoline onto the fire, because of how coffee and then that blood sugar spike, etc. So going back to low blood sugar, 4 hormones designed to raise it. High blood sugar is a product of modern times. Our ancestors probably never really dealt with high blood sugar. So product of modern times is hyperglycemia. And the problem with hyperglycemia is it's inflammatory. So how high blood sugar affects the brain is a few different ways. One, it causes what's called dendritic pruning. So basically, in order for us to think or do anything, for the nervous system to function, that is the result of electrochemical communication between nerve cells. So one nerve cell, neuron, sends a message to another nerve cell, an electrical chemical message to another nerve cell, and that is how transmission works. So basically, dendrites from one nerve cell send an electrochemical message to the axon of another nerve cell, and that's how transmission works. Dendritic pruning is when those dendrites are pruned and that connection is altered, right? It's interfered with, it's eliminated, basically. And so right, intuitively, we can appreciate that means that transmission's not happening. And then that leads into a host of problems in the brain, changes in focus, changes in mood, cognition, sleep, etc. So that's one big problem. Another one is, so glial cells actually make up the bulk of the brain. So we've got neurons, and then they're all surrounded by glial cells. That's what the majority of the mass of the brain is. For every one neuron, there are 10 glial cells. And glial cells are support cells. There's different types. There's microglia, there's astrocytes, there's oligodendrites. And astrocytes are involved in regulating blood sugar and getting glucose into the brain and into neurons. Chronically elevated blood sugar damages those astrocytes, and then it triggers inflammation by stimulating what are called microglia cells. And those microglia cells start releasing pro-inflammatory chemicals. That's, where it's triggering the inflammation. So now we've got damaged neurons. High blood sugar also damages the blood-brain barrier, compromising the protective barrier that encapsulates the brain. We can also appreciate that tryptophan, an amino acid that is the precursor to serotonin, which is our feel-good, calming, soothing, anxiolytic neurochemical. And by the way, serotonin is also converted into melatonin, so supports with sleep. But tryptophan is an amino acid that we get from diet, and it needs insulin in order to cross the blood-brain barrier. In order to get into the brain, it needs insulin. So if we have chronically low blood sugar, or we have these blood sugar swings, then we're not getting the appropriate amino acid precursors into our brain to make adequate levels of our neurochemicals. So, and then as I mentioned before, we can see in neurodegeneration, the brain cells themselves become insulin resistant. And part of that is through the damage to the astrocytes. So this is just a handful of examples of how blood sugar, actually, you know what, I'm not even done. So high blood sugar also creates glycation in the brain, basically gums up enzymes and proteins in the brain, which can alter neurotransmission. It can create electrolyte imbalances. I mean, there's a whole host of ways that blood sugar imbalance directly affects the brain. And anxiety and poor focus and is really just a symptom of that. The last thing I want to say too is this isn't just isolated to the brain. So, blood sugar dysregulation, I would consider one of the most important foundational hallmarks of being healthy, of a healthy brain, mind, and body. I mean, for example, high insulin, high blood sugar is associated with obesity, heart disease, cancer. Cancer cells will actually they're saturated with insulin receptors, depends on the type of cancer, but can be saturated with insulin receptors, therefore stealing our insulin and stealing our glucose. So if we're eating high glucose, we're basically feeding cancer. Sugar creates imbalances within our white blood cells. I mean, I could go on and on and on about the importance of balanced blood sugar, but I'm getting lost and I'm going to bring it back to how blood sugar dysregulation connects back to the brain and how it connects to mental health and performance, especially anxiety and ADD symptoms. Okay, so those are some of the ways, though, that this manifests. So, how do you know then if this is part of your story? I listed off some of the symptoms of blood sugar dysregulation a minute ago, right? Do you become ravenously hungry if you go longer than a couple of hours without eating? Some other symptoms, though, do you crave carbs? Do you crave sweets? Do you especially crave sweets after meals? Like, do you need that little something sweet after dinner, for example? Do you find it difficult to lose weight? Is your hemoglobin A1C on blood work that you've done, is your hemoglobin A1C above 5.1? Above 5.1. If it's above 5.7, I mean, that's full on pre-diabetes. If you're at 5.6, I've actually had some clients tell me that their doctors told them, they're like, oh, you're at 5.6. The cutoff for pre-diabetes is 5.7. Like, you're fine. No, you're like one muffin away from becoming pre-diabetic. I mean, you're already full-blown insulin resistant, right? So let's cut the crap. It's a problem. If you're at 5.6, 5.5, not good. And if you're above that, then definitely. Okay, so let's see. I'm making sure that I'm not missing any points here before I start to move in. Oh, that's what I was going to start to say. You don't go from like normal blood sugar to type 2 diabetes overnight, right? There's a progression. So what that progression looks like is you typically start normal. What I mean by that is I like to see fasting glucose around 5, like 4, 5, somewhere in there. Above 7, and I start raising an eyebrow. I'm sorry, that's insulin. I'm so sorry. I like to see fasting insulin around 4 or 5. Above 7, I start raising an eyebrow. I like to see fasting glucose around 75, between 75 and 90. So between 75 and 90, if it's above 95, and definitely if it's above 100 fasted, then that can be a problem. So if what we're looking for, so normal blood sugar, you start off normal, then typically what happens is people will start experiencing lower blood sugar episodes. So this is sneaky. This can manifest as like I said before, you crave carbs, you crave sugar, you need to eat every few hours. You hit a wall in the afternoon of just like fatigue, you could take a nap. Then what happens with that is when that happens, people will start to eat carbs more often and caffeine oftentimes because that will prop the blood sugar up. Well, when that happens, then the carbs are digested very quickly, and insulin, the blood sugar regulating hormone, spikes to account for those carbs, spikes to get those carbohydrates into the cell where it can be used for fuel. But over time, with repeated insulin spikes, because as the insulin spikes, it drives down the blood sugar. Person craves carbs again, sugar again. They do that, and that pattern continues, right? So over time of these repeated insulin spikes, let me back up. What this is called is reactionary hypoglycemia. Okay, so if you've got lower blood sugar, lower insulin, and let's say you eat like a banana for breakfast or a muffin or like a high carb meal for breakfast, then you have high blood sugar, high insulin that drives the blood sugar low. You crave carb, sugar, eat it again, insulin spikes higher, drives it low, abnormally low. That reactionary hypoglycemia, excuse me, is characterized by major swings in blood sugar instead of just like little molehills throughout the day. As repeated insulin spikes occur, the cells, the tissue, become more and more resistant to insulin. Insulin climbs higher, blood sugar climbs higher, and once it passes a certain point, that would be considered diagnosable for type 2 diabetes, where there's chronically elevated insulin, chronically elevated blood sugar. And then you'll also see some other patterns like high triglycerides, higher cholesterol, things like that go with it too. It's really advanced when pancreatic endocrine function begins to suffer and the pancreas no longer adequately produces insulin and somebody becomes insulin dependent. But that's pretty far advanced for type 2 diabetes. So what can you do about it? I look at blood sugar dysregulation as about 80% diet, 20% environment. And what I mean by that is diet and lifestyle can fix 80% of it. And then for some people, 100% of it. For some people, there is that 20% that's independent of diet and lifestyle. They could have other pre-existing conditions like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, so hypothyroidism. There could be underlying inflammation or mitochondrial toxicity that's actually kind of affecting, or I don't want to say creating the blood sugar issues, but affecting blood sugar utilization inside the cell. There can be gut microbiome imbalances. So there can be other things, environmental factors independent of diet, but nonetheless, we always start with diet. So some of the top things that I would recommend. One, try to push when you have breakfast by, an hour or two later in the morning, or finish eating an hour or two earlier in the day so that you have a longer gap, ideally at least 12 hours, if not 14, like sometimes up to 16 hours between dinner and breakfast the next day. So this is called time restricted eating and a form of intermittent fasting. 12 to 14 is great for pretty much everyone. There are some exceptions to that though, but I will recommend that often is what I'm saying. And then for some people getting up to 16, men in particular tend to respond really well to that 16-hour mark. So like finishing eating earlier in the day or starting and eating later in the day can help with that. And that's because it restricts glucose, and that restricted glucose will help restore insulin receptors and insulin sensitivity. Number 2 is stop eating at least 2 hours before bedtime. Number 3, break your fast with protein. Carbohydrates are digested and absorbed and hit our bloodstream very quickly, whereas fat and protein is like a time release fuel supply. So something like, it doesn't mean that it has to be like very low carb or no carb. You can still have some carbs, but keep that first meal of the day lower carb and higher protein, higher fat. So for example, a couple of eggs scrambled with some mixed greens and half of a sweet potato. You could have a smoothie with a protein powder. Plant-based protein powder is great, blended with half a quarter of a cup of frozen blueberries and coconut flakes and some other healthy fats in there, like flax oil, for example. You could have a protein bar, like a Bulletproof or Go Raw pumpkin bar. Let's see, those are two of my favorites for protein bars. Again, with like a couple of eggs or some nuts and seeds. You could have a frittata type thing. So again, you get the idea of like emphasizing the protein and fat, lower carb. And so if you do that, if you break your fast with protein and you delay, you aim for 12, 14, up to 16 hours of time restricted eating overnight, that's getting up to, call it 14 to 18 hours of keeping insulin and blood sugar nice and low. And then optimally, you have one meal a day that really emphasizes the carbs and has concentrated carbohydrates like starchy vegetables or fruit or grains. And the other 1 to 2 meals, if you're having 2 to 3 meals per day, are lower carb. And that way, that really minimizes the insulin and blood sugar spike during the day. And then lastly, exercise is critical. Any kind of movement. But what exercise does, so diet will keep the blood sugar lower and insulin levels low and stable. Exercise increases our demand for glucose. So exercise will also help with the insulin sensitivity because our cells become more hungry, right? They burned a lot of fuel. We need a lot more fuel, simply put. So one of the easiest ways I recommend of getting an exercise is a 10-minute HIIT workout. I talk about this all the time. I do this personally. I recommend it to clients all the time because it's 10 minutes. And the research is very evident that short duration, high intensity interval training gives many benefits, even in some cases more than longer duration, sustained intensity workouts do. So interval training is where you alternate periods of like your max effort with periods of rest. So I recommend 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, basically. 30 seconds your max effort, 30 seconds of rest for 10 minutes. There's great workouts online. You can look on YouTube. You can look at the Sweat app. You can look at the Peloton app. There's great resources out there, body weight based, dumbbells. Like you don't need a lot of equipment, but HIIT is great. Even better is if you can start working that in to the morning period when you're fasted. You might not want to start with this, but that's a great place to work into, is getting in that 10-minute HIIT workout while you're fasted. And then you can, go on with the rest of your day and eat. But that really ramps up the insulin sensitivity. But really any kind of exercise, if you like going for long walks, if you like hiking, dancing, going to the gym, swimming, running, whatever it might be, but any kind of exercise, at least 10 minutes, up to 30 is great. If you want to do longer than that, bonus, but it really doesn't have to be an hour to be effective. But so to recap, time restricted eating, prolong the duration between when you finish eating the night before it, when you start eating the next day, 12 hours at a minimum, ideally work up to 14, in some cases 16. Break your fast with predominantly protein and fat with a little bit of carb. Keep the concentrated carbohydrates like fruit and grains to one meal per day to keep insulin and blood sugar nice and low, and then get in exercise and some form of movement daily. All right. And then seriously watch the transformation in your focus. Your energy levels are more sustained during the day. Your mood can be much more stabilized. Like that is a foundational pillar that we work on with all clients. All right, everyone. I hope that helped. Drop a comment. Let me know how this resonated with you. And also tag me in any questions or comments that you have, and I'll always come through and answer them too. And then lastly, if you're listening to this, and so in my practice, Progressive Health and Wellness, my online nutrition and wellness practice, I work with ambitious men and women who are struggling with anxiety and mental performance by taking a root-caused body-mind approach to help them restore feelings of calm confidence. So if you're ready to find answers as to why you feel anxious, or you can't focus, or you feel depressed, or you're struggling in your mental health and performance, schedule a free 15-minute call with me. You can either drop a comment, I'll link to it in this post. And let's have a conversation and we'll talk about what you're looking for and how we can help. And if it feels like a good fit, great. And if not, that's okay too. And you might be able to hear my little daughter right now. I think she's getting her diaper changed. She just woke up from a nap. All right, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Talk to you soon. Bye.